In the summer of 2019, a frantic 911 call came from the entrance of Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. The caller, barely able to speak through hyperventilation, claimed to be the only survivor of a 12-person cave expedition that had gone terribly wrong. When rescue teams finally extracted him from the cave mouth, they found him clutching a helmet camera with corrupted footage and repeating the same phrase over and over. "They're still down there, but they're not the same anymore." What happened in those pitch-black depths over the next 72 hours would challenge everything we thought we knew about what lurks in the unexplored chambers beneath our feet. The footage recovered from various helmet cameras tells a story so disturbing that 3 rescue workers quit their jobs after reviewing it, and the cave system was quietly sealed off to the public just weeks later. Tonight, we're bringing you 12 verified accounts from the deepest, most isolated cave systems around the world, where experienced explorers encountered something that made them question their own sanity. These aren't urban legends or campfire stories. These are documented incidents with witness testimonies, emergency response records, and, in some cases, physical evidence that investigators still can't explain. Before we descend into these tales of underground horror, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because once you hear what happened in these caves, you'll never look at a dark hole in the ground the same way again. Fair warning, what you're about to hear might make you reconsider ever going underground, even in the most well-mapped tourist caves, because sometimes the most terrifying discoveries are the ones that were never meant to be found. Story 1. Marcus Chen had been exploring caves for 15 years, mapping uncharted systems across the Pacific Northwest with methodical precision that had earned him respect among professional spelunkers worldwide. His reputation was built on never taking unnecessary risks and always following strict safety protocols, which made what happened to him in Crystal Falls Cave in Oregon all the more disturbing. On March 14, 2021, Marcus arrived at the cave entrance at dawn, equipped with his usual gear: 2 high-powered LED headlamps, backup batteries, emergency beacon, climbing rope, and enough supplies for a 12-hour expedition. Crystal Falls Cave was known for its pristine limestone formations and underground waterfalls, but large sections remained unmapped, presenting the perfect challenge for someone of Marcus's experience. He'd studied geological surveys for months, planned his route carefully, and even informed the local park service of his intended path through the cave system. The first 3 hours went exactly as planned. Marcus methodically documented passages, took photographs of unique formations, and carefully marked his route with biodegradable tape markers every 50 feet. The cave was everything he'd hoped: massive chambers with cathedral-like acoustics, delicate flowstone formations that looked like frozen waterfalls, and pools of crystal-clear water that reflected his headlamp beam like mirrors. He was particularly excited about discovering a chamber filled with rare helictites, twisted cave formations that seemed to defy gravity as they spiraled in impossible directions. Marcus spent nearly an hour photographing these formations, completely absorbed in his work, when disaster struck without warning. His primary headlamp, a military-grade unit that had never failed him in 5 years of cave exploration, suddenly died with a soft, electronic pop. The chamber plunged into darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. Marcus immediately reached for his backup light, but the sudden transition from bright LED illumination to the dimmer backup created disorienting shadows that made familiar formations look alien and threatening. More concerning was the fact that his primary light had been fully charged that morning, with enough battery life for at least 20 hours of continuous use. Electronic equipment failures in caves were rare but potentially deadly, and Marcus knew he needed to begin his exit immediately. As he carefully retraced his steps using his backup illumination, Marcus followed his biodegradable tape markers with religious precision. Each marker was exactly where he'd placed it, but something felt wrong about the cave passages. They seemed narrower somehow, and formations he remembered passing on the way in appeared subtly different. The helictite chamber, which should have been his second-to-last landmark before the main passage, was nowhere to be found, Instead, he discovered passages that looked familiar but felt wrong, as if he was seeing a distorted reflection of the route he'd taken hours earlier. It was then that Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the soft cave mud near a small underground stream, he found fresh boot prints that definitely weren't his own, leading deeper into unexplored tunnels he hadn't yet entered. The prints were identical to his hiking boots down to the distinctive Vibram sole pattern and the small nick on the right heel from a climbing accident years earlier. Every detail matched perfectly, but the prints were heading in the opposite direction from where he'd been walking, and they were clearly fresh, made within the last few hours based on the sharp edges in the mud. Fighting off panic, Marcus told himself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps another explorer was using the same brand of boots, or maybe he'd somehow gotten turned around and was looking at his own prints from an earlier part of the expedition. But as he examined the tracks more carefully with his dimming backup light, he realized these prints were leading into sections of the cave he definitely hadn't explored. The mud showed a clear trail heading into a passage he'd marked on his map as unexplored, return trip, yet here were his exact boot prints disappearing into that dark tunnel. Marcus made what would later seem like the worst decision of his life. He decided to follow the mysterious tracks, convinced that another explorer might be lost somewhere ahead and in need of help. The prints led him through increasingly narrow passages that required him to crawl on hands and knees, then opened into chambers he'd never seen before. Strange mineral formations caught his light, creating twisted shadows that seemed to move independently of his lamp beam. The air grew colder and carried an odd metallic taste that made him slightly nauseous. Hours passed as he followed the identical footprints through a maze of tunnels that seemed to spiral deeper into the earth. Marcus called out regularly for the other explorer, his voice echoing strangely in the confined spaces, but he received only his own distorted echo in response. The sound seemed to bounce off the cave walls in impossible ways, sometimes returning seconds after it should have, sometimes not returning at all. More disturbing was how his echo seemed to change tone and pitch, as if the cave itself was modifying his voice before sending it back. When his backup light began to dim noticeably, Marcus checked his watch and realized with growing terror that he'd been following the footprints for over 6 hours. According to his calculations, he should have reached the cave's deepest mapped sections hours ago, yet he seemed to be descending into passages that weren't on any survey. The temperature had dropped significantly, and his breath was now visible in the beam of his failing light. Ice formations that shouldn't exist at this depth began appearing on the cave walls, and the footprints he was following became even more numerous, as if multiple people wearing identical boots had walked this path. The prints began to branch off into side passages, creating a confusing network of identical tracks that led in every direction. Some prints seemed to double back on themselves, creating loops and spirals that made no logical sense for someone trying to navigate out of a cave. Marcus tried to maintain his bearings using his compass, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north in the iron-rich cave environment. His GPS unit showed no signal, which was expected deep underground, but his backup navigation tools were proving useless in the maze of tunnels. As his backup light continued to fade, casting increasingly weak beams that barely illuminated a few feet ahead, Marcus began to hear something that made his skin crawl. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, echoing through the tunnel system, came the unmistakable sound of boots walking on stone and mud. The footsteps matched his exact pace and rhythm, speeding up when he moved faster, slowing when he paused to listen. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if several people were walking parallel paths through the cave system. Marcus stopped moving and called out, "Hello? I can hear you walking. Are you lost too?" His voice echoed through the tunnels, but the footsteps stopped immediately, creating a silence so complete it felt like being wrapped in cotton. In that deafening quiet, Marcus could hear his own heart pounding and the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. He waited for a response, but none came. When he started walking again, the footsteps resumed, perfectly synchronized with his movements. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd been following his own footprints in circles for hours, but someone or something else had been walking behind him the entire time, perfectly mimicking his movements and creating additional tracks in the cave mud. The identical boot prints weren't from another explorer wearing the same boots. They were his own prints from multiple passes through the same passages, but multiplied in ways that defied explanation. As his light finally began to die, casting only a weak orange glow that barely penetrated the darkness, Marcus discovered the most terrifying truth of all. He was standing in a small circular chamber he didn't remember entering, surrounded by hundreds of identical boot prints that spiraled around the room in increasingly tight circles. The prints covered every inch of the muddy floor, overlapping and intersecting in patterns that would have taken days to create, yet he'd only been in the cave for 9 hours. In the center of the chamber, Marcus found his own biodegradable tape markers arranged in a neat pile, even though he distinctly remembered placing them throughout the cave system. His emergency beacon, which should have been clipped to his belt, was lying next to the markers, though he had no memory of removing it. Most disturbing of all, his primary headlamp, the one that had failed hours earlier, was sitting beside his other gear, and when he picked it up with shaking hands, it turned on immediately, casting bright white light throughout the chamber and revealing the full scope of the impossible footprint pattern surrounding him. Marcus later told investigators that he spent the remaining hours before rescue, sitting in that chamber, afraid to move, listening to footsteps circling him in the darkness just beyond the range of his restored headlight. The sounds never got closer, but they never stopped, maintaining a constant rhythm like a heartbeat echoing through the cave system. He described hearing his own voice calling out from distant tunnels, asking for help, but he never opened his mouth to speak. When the rescue team found Marcus 18 hours after he'd entered the cave, they discovered him exactly where he claimed to be, sitting catatonic in a small chamber, clutching his functioning headlamp, surrounded by an impossible spiral pattern of identical boot prints. The rescue team leader, a veteran of cave rescues with 20 years of experience, later testified that the footprint pattern was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The prints were definitely from Marcus's boots, but there were far too many of them to have been created by one person in the time frame involved. More puzzling was the fact that Marcus was found less than half a mile from the cave entrance, in a chamber that was clearly marked on cave survey maps as Tourist Stop 3, Main Route. According to the maps, it should have been impossible for an experienced spelunker to get lost so close to the entrance, yet Marcus insisted he'd been walking deeper into unmapped territory for hours. The biodegradable markers he claimed to have placed throughout the cave were never found, despite extensive searches by the rescue team. The incident report noted several unexplained elements. Marcus's GPS unit, which had been non-functional during his ordeal, began working normally as soon as the rescue team arrived. His primary headlamp, which he claimed had failed early in the expedition, showed a full battery charge and operated perfectly. And, perhaps most disturbing, the rescue team's sensitive audio equipment picked up what sounded like distant footsteps throughout their time in the chamber, even though all team members were accounted for and stationary. Marcus Chen never returned to cave exploration after that day. He sold all his equipment and moved to a different state, refusing to discuss the incident beyond his initial statement to investigators. The Crystal Falls cave system remains open to the public, but the chamber where Marcus was found has been quietly removed from the standard tour route. Park rangers report that visitors occasionally ask about strange echoes and the sound of footsteps in empty passages, but these reports are typically attributed to the acoustic properties of limestone cave systems. However, 3 months after Marcus's incident, another experienced spelunker reported getting lost in the same cave system and finding unusual boot prints that didn't match his own equipment. That explorer was found within hours and experienced no lasting effects, but his description of the footprint patterns was remarkably similar to Marcus's account. Since then, Crystal Falls Cave has implemented a strict policy requiring all explorers to carry multiple backup navigation systems and to explore only in groups of 3 or more. The official explanation for Marcus's experience centers on equipment failure leading to disorientation and panic, causing him to walk in circles while in a confused mental state. However, no explanation has ever been provided for the impossible number of footprints found in the chamber, or for the fact that his supposedly malfunctioning equipment worked perfectly for everyone else who handled it. The case remains listed as Incident with Unexplained Elements in the National Cave Rescue Commission's database, a designation reserved for fewer than 2% of all cave rescue operations. Story 2. Sarah Blackwood was a marine biology graduate student who joined a cave diving expedition in Devil's Throat Cave, Florida, on October 8, 2020. The team of 5 experienced divers was led by Dr. Rebecca Torres, exploring underwater passages to document rare cave fish species. Sarah had logged over 300 cave dives and felt confident navigating the crystal-clear waters of the limestone cave system. The dive began perfectly as they descended into the main chamber, their lights illuminating bioluminescent bacterial formations on the walls. Sarah spent the first hour photographing blind cave fish and collecting water samples, maintaining visual contact with her team as planned. Dr. Torres had briefed them on exploring a newly discovered narrow passage that connected to an air-filled chamber 400 feet from the entrance. Following protocol, Torres entered the narrow tunnel first, followed by team member James Mitchell. Sarah waited the predetermined 2 minutes before approaching the passage entrance, but something immediately felt wrong. The tunnel appeared much narrower than described, and the water inside looked darker and less clear than the pristine conditions in the main chamber. As Sarah squeezed into the passage, her equipment scraping against limestone walls, she realized the tunnel extended far beyond the 50-foot distance Torres had mentioned. 20 minutes into what should have been a 2-minute transit, Sarah found herself wedged in a section so narrow she couldn't turn around. Her air gauge showed she'd consumed a third of her supply, and panic set in as she realized she was trapped in complete darkness with no escape route. Fighting to control her breathing, Sarah attempted to back out but discovered her equipment was caught on rock formations. More disturbing, her depth gauge showed impossible readings, indicating she was descending even though she was moving horizontally. The tunnel walls seemed to be moving, contracting around her with increasing pressure that compressed her equipment against her body. In desperation, Sarah activated her emergency beacon, sending distress signals through the water. The device flashed its bright strobe, but the light seemed absorbed by the surrounding water. Then something terrifying happened. Answering flashes began coming from deeper in the tunnel. Multiple light sources, all flashing the identical distress pattern in perfect synchronization, as if other divers were trapped throughout the passage. The responding lights began moving toward her faster than any human could swim through such a confined space, coming from impossible directions, ahead, above, and below, as if the tunnel had branches that hadn't existed when she entered. With less than 10 minutes of air remaining, Sarah used her diving knife to cut away caught equipment, desperate to create space to move. As she worked frantically, something brushed against her fins from behind. Turning her head, Sarah saw her own lights reflecting off what appeared to be still water, showing her exact reflection positioned upside down like a mirror on the tunnel floor. The reflection began moving independently, swimming toward her through the passage with fluid movements impossible in such a confined space. As the figure drew closer, Sarah realized it was wearing identical equipment but older and corroded, as if it had been underwater for years. The diving suit showed damage from prolonged cave exposure, and the lights were dimmer, powered by failing batteries. In her final minutes of air supply, multiple reflections of herself appeared in the water around her, each wearing different equipment and showing various stages of decay, some screaming silently into their regulators, others hanging motionless as if they had died long ago. Her air ran out as the decomposing reflections reached for her with cold, lifeless hands. Sarah's last memory was being pulled deeper into the passage by figures that looked exactly like her, feeling herself becoming one of the reflections watching as a new version of herself entered the same terrifying cycle. The rescue team found Sarah 3 hours later, unconscious and floating in the main chamber with full air tanks and normally functioning equipment. Dr. Torres and Mitchell reported they had never entered any narrow passage and had been searching the main chamber when Sarah failed to follow the dive plan. Most puzzling was that detailed sonar mapping showed no narrow connecting passage existed where Sarah claimed to have been trapped. Sarah's diving computer recorded that she had remained stationary in the main chamber for 3 hours, never moving more than 50 feet from her entry point, registering no depth changes or emergency beacon activation. However, she suffered severe decompression sickness despite never exceeding safe depths, requiring immediate hyperbaric treatment for symptoms typically associated with much deeper dives. The photographs Sarah captured showed unexplained translucent figures wearing similar diving equipment in the background, not visible to any team members during the dive. 6 months later, Sarah abandoned her marine biology studies, unable to enter water deeper than a swimming pool without severe panic attacks. She reported recurring nightmares about being trapped underwater with multiple versions of herself and became convinced part of herself remained in Devil's Throat Cave. 2 years later, a professional diving instructor reported seeing a female diver matching Sarah's description in the main chamber, wearing corroded equipment and signaling distress. When he approached to help, the figure disappeared, but his camera captured frames showing what appeared to be Sarah Blackwood, still trapped and signaling for help in the depths of the cave she had left years earlier. Story 3. Daniel Rodriguez was a geologist specializing in cave mineral formations when he received permission to conduct a solo research expedition in Whispering Caverns, a remote cave system in West Virginia that had been sealed to the public for over 30 years following a series of unexplained accidents. On November 12, 2022, Daniel entered the cave armed with advanced geological equipment, planning a 4-day study of rare crystal formations that had only been documented in faded photographs from the 1980s. What he discovered in those depths would force authorities to permanently seal the cave and classify his research findings under a level of secrecy typically reserved for national security matters. Daniel's first day proceeded exactly as planned as he descended into the main cavern, his high-powered LED arrays illuminating walls covered in spectacular mineral deposits that exceeded his wildest expectations. The cave contained formations of selenite crystals over 10 feet tall, creating a natural cathedral of translucent white spires that caught and refracted his lights into prismatic rainbows. He spent hours photographing and cataloging specimens, completely absorbed in documenting formations that represented millions of years of geological processes. The cave's acoustics were remarkable, with even his quiet breathing creating subtle echoes that seemed to harmonize with the constant dripping of mineral-rich water. On his second day, while exploring a previously unmapped section of the cave system, Daniel made a discovery that initially thrilled him but would soon become the source of his nightmares. Hidden behind a curtain of flowstone formations, he found a narrow passage that opened into a chamber unlike anything in geological literature. The walls were covered entirely in perfectly spherical crystal formations, each one roughly the size of a human head and glowing with a faint internal light that didn't require his external illumination to be visible. As Daniel approached the crystal formations with his sampling equipment, he noticed something that made him pause. Each crystal sphere contained what appeared to be a perfectly preserved human face, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The faces were incredibly detailed, showing every line and wrinkle with photographic clarity, and they appeared to be looking directly at him regardless of his position in the chamber. Daniel's scientific training told him he was looking at some form of mineral inclusion, possibly organic material that had been fossilized within the crystal matrix over geological time periods. However, as he began taking photographs and mineral samples, Daniel realized the faces in the crystals were not ancient fossils, but appeared to be contemporary, showing people wearing modern clothing and hairstyles. More disturbing was his growing recognition of some of the faces. They matched missing person reports from the local area dating back to the 1970s. When Whispering Caverns had still been open to recreational cavers, Daniel had researched the cave's history extensively and remembered seeing photographs of several people who had disappeared during expeditions and were never found. Using his geological hammer to carefully extract a small sample from one of the crystal formations, Daniel made a discovery that challenged everything he understood about mineralogy and physics. The crystal was warm to the touch, maintaining a temperature several degrees above the cave's ambient 55 degrees, and it seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat. Under his magnifying lens, the face trapped within the crystal appeared to have tears frozen in the mineral matrix, and the eyes seemed to track his movements with an awareness that suggested consciousness rather than mere mineral inclusion. That night, as Daniel set up his camp in the main chamber, he began hearing sounds that hadn't been present during his first day in the cave. Soft whispers echoed through the passages, too quiet to understand, but clearly human voices speaking in urgent, frightened tones. The whispers seemed to come from the direction of the crystal chamber, and they grew louder and more distinct as the hours passed. By midnight, Daniel could clearly hear people calling for help, screaming in terror and pleading for someone to find them, but the voices had a strange quality that made them sound both immediate and impossibly distant. Unable to sleep, Daniel decided to return to the crystal chamber with his audio recording equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the phenomenon for later analysis. As he approached the hidden passage, his equipment began malfunctioning in ways he'd never experienced. His digital camera produced images that showed the crystal formations as empty, despite clearly containing faces when viewed directly. His audio recorder captured only silence, even when the whispers were loud enough to make conversation difficult. In the crystal chamber, Daniel made the most terrifying discovery of his expedition. The faces in the crystal formations were no longer frozen in static expressions but were moving, blinking, and silently screaming as if trying to communicate with him. Their mouths moved in synchronization, all attempting to speak the same words, but no sound emerged from the crystal matrix. Using his geological training in lip reading, Daniel realized they were all saying the same thing repeatedly. "Don't let them see you." As he watched in horror, new faces began appearing in previously empty crystal formations, materializing slowly as if the mineral matrix was somehow capturing and preserving people in real time. Daniel recognized some of the new faces as missing persons from more recent years, people who had disappeared from the local area within the last decade. The crystals were somehow collecting people, trapping their consciousness within the mineral structure while their physical bodies dissolved into the geological matrix. Daniel's flashlight began to dim despite fresh batteries, and he realized the crystal formations were somehow draining electrical energy from his equipment. In the fading light, he saw movement in the shadows beyond the crystal chamber, tall, humanoid figures that seemed to be made of the same mineral composition as the cave walls. These beings moved with fluid grace through the passages, their crystalline bodies refracting what little light remained and creating rainbow patterns on the cave walls. The crystal entities appeared to be harvesting the trapped consciousness from the formations, carefully extracting glowing orbs of light from within each sphere and consuming them with an hunger that suggested they had been feeding on human awareness for decades. Daniel watched in paralyzed terror as the faces in the crystals aged rapidly once their inner light was consumed, their expressions shifting from terror to resignation to empty lifelessness before the crystal formations crumbled into dust. Realizing he was witnessing a feeding process that had been occurring for years, Daniel understood why so many people had disappeared in Whispering Caverns and why the cave had been sealed. The crystalline entities were farming human consciousness, using the cave's unique mineral composition to trap people's minds while their bodies were absorbed into the geological structure. The whispers he'd been hearing were the final thoughts of countless victims, echoing through the cave system as their consciousness was slowly consumed. Daniel managed to escape the crystal chamber only because the entities seemed to feed in cycles, becoming dormant after consuming a certain number of consciousness orbs. He spent his remaining 2 days in the cave, documenting everything he could while avoiding the crystal beings, but his equipment continued to malfunction whenever he tried to record direct evidence of the phenomena. His geological samples, when analyzed later in laboratory conditions, showed impossible mineral compositions that violated basic laws of chemistry. When Daniel emerged from Whispering Caverns 4 days later, he was found by park rangers in a state of severe psychological distress, clutching crystal samples that had somehow become empty of their trapped faces during his journey to the surface. His research notes contained detailed descriptions of the crystalline entities and their feeding process, but all his photographic evidence showed only normal cave formations. Laboratory analysis of his mineral samples revealed crystal structures that shouldn't exist in nature, but no trace of organic material or consciousness preservation. The authorities sealed Whispering Caverns permanently within a week of Daniel's return, citing geological instability as the official reason for closure. Daniel's research findings were classified and removed from public access, and he was required to sign extensive, non-disclosure agreements regarding his discoveries. However, local missing person cases in the area dropped to 0 after the cave was sealed, supporting Daniel's claims about the entity's feeding patterns. Daniel never returned to geological research, instead becoming a reclusive artist who creates crystal sculptures that bear an unsettling resemblance to the formations he discovered in Whispering Caverns. Visitors to his studio report that the sculptures seem to contain faces visible only in peripheral vision, and some claim to hear faint whispers when standing near his work. Daniel refuses to discuss his cave research, but has been heard telling visitors that some minerals are meant to remain undisturbed, and that human consciousness is far more fragile than most people realize. The official explanation for the incidents at Whispering Caverns focuses on psychological effects of prolonged cave exploration, including hallucinations caused by sensory deprivation and carbon dioxide buildup in poorly ventilated passages. However, geological surveys conducted after the cave's closure detected unusual electromagnetic anomalies throughout the system, and several researchers reported equipment malfunctions identical to those experienced by Daniel. The cave remains sealed with concrete barriers, and the surrounding area has been quietly purchased by undisclosed government agencies to prevent any future exploration attempts. Story 4. Elena Vasquez was a professional cave rescue specialist with 12 years of experience when she received an emergency call on February 19, 2023, about a group of college students trapped in Blackwater Canyon Cave in Utah after a flash flood had sealed their exit route. Elena had successfully completed over 200 cave rescues during her career and was known for her ability to remain calm under the most dangerous conditions. But what she encountered during this rescue operation would force her to retire from cave work and seek intensive psychological treatment for trauma-related disorders. The initial emergency report indicated that 5 students from the University of Utah Geology Department had entered Blackwater Canyon for a routine educational expedition when an unexpected storm system caused rapid flooding in the cave's lower passages. The students had managed to reach higher ground within the cave system and were communicating with surface rescue teams through a narrow crevice, but rising water levels threatened to cut off all access routes within hours. Elena was part of a 3-person rescue team that included veteran cave specialist Mike Torres and emergency medical technician Jessica Chen, all equipped with specialized water rescue gear and emergency breathing apparatus. The rescue team entered Blackwater Canyon through an alternate entrance that provided access to the upper levels where the students were believed to be trapped. The cave system was notorious for its unstable water conditions, with underground streams that could rise 20 feet in minutes during heavy rainfall, but Elena had worked in similar conditions dozens of times. The team's plan was straightforward: locate the trapped students, assess their condition, and guide them through emergency exit routes that bypass the flooded main passages. As they descended into the cave system, Elena immediately noticed that the water levels were higher than expected, with several passages already completely submerged that should have remained accessible according to their flood charts. More concerning was the water's unusual appearance. Instead of the muddy brown color typical of floodwater, the rising liquid was completely black and had an oily consistency that left dark stains on everything it touched. The water also carried a metallic smell that made breathing difficult and caused burning sensations in their eyes and throats. 2 hours into the rescue operation, the team reached the area where the students were supposed to be trapped, but found no sign of human presence. Their emergency communication equipment detected the students' distress beacon signals, but the signals seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a confusing maze of electronic noise that made precise location impossible. Elena's team began a systematic search of the upper passages, calling out for the students and listening for responses, but they heard only their own voices echoing strangely through the flooded cave system. As they searched deeper into the cave, Elena began noticing something that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The black floodwater wasn't behaving like normal liquid. It seemed to move independently of gravitational flow, sometimes flowing upward against cave walls or collecting in pools that defied the passage's natural drainage patterns. More disturbing was the way their lights reflected off the water's surface, creating images that looked like faces staring up at them from beneath the dark liquid. When Elena knelt to test the water's depth with her rescue pole, she felt something grab the end of the equipment and pull it downward with tremendous force. The pole was yanked from her hands and disappeared completely into the black water, even though the pool appeared to be only a few inches deep. Mike Torres attempted to retrieve the pole with his own equipment, but his rescue hook emerged from the water covered in a thick, tar-like substance that seemed to move and pulse with its own life. The team's radio communication with surface support began experiencing severe interference, with their reports being interrupted by what sounded like voices calling for help from somewhere within the cave system. The voices matched the descriptions of the missing students, but they seemed to be coming from the Blackwater itself rather than from any physical location the rescue team could access. Elena tried to trace the voices to their source, but every time she approached an area where the calls seemed loudest, the sounds would move to a different part of the cave. Jessica Chen was the first to notice that their emergency breathing apparatus was malfunctioning in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Despite carrying full oxygen tanks, all 3 team members began experiencing symptoms of oxygen deprivation, dizziness, confusion, and difficulty breathing, as if the air around them was being drained of breathable gases. Their equipment gauges showed normal oxygen levels, but their bodies were responding as if they were in an environment with severely reduced air quality. As the black water continued to rise, reaching levels that threatened to flood passages the team needed for their exit route, Elena made the decision to attempt direct contact with the trapped students using emergency diving procedures. She entered the black water wearing full protective gear, but immediately realized something was fundamentally wrong with the liquid. Instead of supporting her body weight like normal water, the black substance seemed to have variable density, sometimes thick enough to walk on, and other times thin enough that she sank rapidly toward the cave floor. Underwater, Elena's diving lights revealed an impossible sight that challenged her understanding of cave geology and physics. The black water extended far deeper than the cave's natural floor should have allowed, creating vast, underwater chambers that didn't exist on any cave survey. Within these impossible depths, Elena saw what appeared to be the missing students floating motionless, their bodies preserved perfectly but their eyes reflecting her lights with an unnatural brilliance that suggested consciousness despite their apparent death. The students appeared to be trying to communicate with her, their mouths moving in silent speech and their hands gesturing desperately toward something deeper in the black water. Following their gestures, Elena discovered that the liquid wasn't water at all but some form of living substance that had invaded the cave system. The black material pulsed and flowed with purposeful movement, and Elena realized it was somehow feeding on the students, preserving their bodies while consuming their life force in a process that kept them aware but unable to escape. Elena's diving equipment began failing as the black substance infiltrated her breathing apparatus and diving suit. The material seemed to be acidic, dissolving her protective gear while simultaneously trying to enter her body through any available opening. As her oxygen supply became contaminated with the black liquid, Elena experienced hallucinations that showed her the substance's history. It had been dormant in deep underground reservoirs for centuries until recent geological changes had allowed it to rise into the cave system during flood conditions. Fighting her way back to the surface, Elena discovered that Mike Torres and Jessica Chen had been partially consumed by the black substance. Their lower bodies dissolved into the same tar-like material that was spreading throughout the cave. They remained conscious but unable to move, trapped in the same preservation state as the missing students. Elena realized that the entire rescue operation had been a trap, with the substance using the students' distress signals to lure additional victims into the cave system. Elena managed to escape Blackwater Canyon only because the black substance seemed to have a feeding limit, becoming dormant after consuming a certain amount of organic material. She emerged from the cave alone, covered in chemical burns from the acidic black liquid, and immediately called for evacuation of the entire area. Her rescue equipment showed impossible readings, depth measurements that exceeded the cave's known dimensions and atmospheric readings that indicated the presence of gases unknown to science. The official rescue report classified the incident as a chemical contamination event caused by industrial pollutants released during the flash flood. The 5 missing students and Elena's 2 team members were declared victims of toxic exposure, and Blackwater Canyon was permanently sealed with concrete barriers. However, Elena's detailed testimony about the living black substance was suppressed from public records, and she was required to undergo extensive psychological evaluation before being released from emergency medical care. Elena never returned to cave rescue work, instead becoming an advocate for stricter cave safety protocols and geological monitoring systems. She reports recurring nightmares about being trapped in black water and claims to still taste the metallic flavor of the substance years after her exposure. Most disturbing are Elena's reports that she occasionally receives radio calls on emergency frequencies from voices that match her missing team members, calling for rescue from somewhere deep underground. Local authorities continue to monitor the sealed Blackwater Canyon for signs of geological activity, and several unexplained incidents have been reported in the area since Elena's rescue attempt. Hikers have reported finding pools of black water in areas where no water sources should exist, and emergency responders have received multiple false alarms distress calls that trace back to the sealed cave system. While the official explanation focuses on chemical contamination and psychological trauma, the complete absence of any industrial facilities in the area has never been adequately explained, leaving Elena's account as the only detailed record of what actually occurred in the depths of Blackwater Canyon. Story 5. Thomas Garrett was a documentary filmmaker specializing in extreme environments when he decided to create a film about solo cave exploration in the remote Harrington Depths cave system in Montana, a decision that would result in footage so disturbing that it was immediately confiscated by federal authorities and classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. On March 7, 2021, Thomas entered the cave alone, carrying professional filming equipment, planning to document the psychological challenges of extended isolation in underground environments for what he hoped would be an award-winning independent film. Thomas had spent months preparing for the expedition, studying the cave's layout and installing emergency communication systems at key points throughout the accessible passages. The Harrington Depths system was known for its incredible acoustic properties, with some chambers capable of amplifying whispers into thunderous echoes, making it perfect for the atmospheric documentary he envisioned. His plan was to spend 5 days alone in the cave, filming his psychological journey as he pushed deeper into unexplored territories while maintaining detailed audio logs of his mental state. The first 2 days proceeded exactly as Thomas had planned, with his high-definition cameras capturing spectacular footage of limestone formations and underground waterfalls that had never been professionally filmed. His audio logs documented the expected psychological effects of cave isolation, initial excitement giving way to mild anxiety as the constant darkness began affecting his circadian rhythms. Thomas was particularly pleased with the cave's natural acoustics, which added an ethereal quality to his narration that he knew would create powerful emotional impact in the final documentary. On his third day, while exploring a previously unmapped section of the cave system, Thomas discovered something that initially excited him, but would soon become the source of pure terror. Hidden behind a wall of flowstone formations, he found a chamber that contained what appeared to be professional film equipment from several decades earlier. Cameras, lights, and recording devices that showed signs of long-term cave exposure but were still partially functional. The equipment was far more advanced than what should have been available in the 1970s or 1980s, featuring digital components and battery systems that wouldn't be invented for years after the equipment's apparent age. As Thomas examined the mysterious filming gear, he discovered that some of the devices were still recording, their memory systems containing footage that made his blood run cold. The recorded material showed the same cave passages he'd been exploring, but filmed from impossible perspectives. Cameras positioned in locations no human could reach, capturing footage of people moving through the cave system at times when no expeditions were scheduled. More disturbing was the fact that some of the footage appeared to show Thomas himself, filmed during his current expedition, but from angles that suggested cameras had been following him without his knowledge. Thomas's excitement about finding historic cave footage quickly turned to horror as he reviewed more of the recorded material. The footage showed dozens of different people exploring the Harrington Depths system over what appeared to be many years, but all of them were making the same discoveries in the same sequence: finding the hidden chamber, discovering the filming equipment, and reviewing the same footage Thomas was now watching. Each person showed identical reactions of confusion, excitement, and growing terror as they realized they were trapped in some form of recurring cycle. The most terrifying revelation came when Thomas found footage of himself from expeditions he had no memory of making. The recordings showed him entering the cave on multiple occasions, wearing different clothing and carrying different equipment, but always following the same route and making the same discoveries. In some footage he appeared younger, in others older, and in the most disturbing recordings he looked exactly as he did now, but was clearly exhausted and desperate, as if he had been trapped in the cave for weeks or months. Thomas's professional filming equipment began malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation, producing footage that showed events before they happened and recording sounds that weren't audible to his ears. His cameras captured conversations with people who weren't there, showing Thomas responding to questions and comments from invisible speakers. Most disturbing was his growing realization that he was having those conversations, responding to voices only his equipment could detect, engaging in detailed discussions about cave exploration with entities that existed only on his recorded footage. As Thomas reviewed hours of his own recordings, he discovered that his audio logs contained information he had no memory of speaking. The recordings documented cave passages he hadn't explored, described equipment he hadn't found, and included detailed conversations with other explorers who supposedly weren't in the cave system. His voice on the recordings discussed plans to meet other expedition members at specific locations, but Thomas had entered the cave completely alone and had encountered no other people during his time underground. The cave's acoustic properties began working against Thomas in ways that transformed his documentary project into a psychological nightmare. His own voice, recorded hours or days earlier, began echoing through the cave passages at volumes and frequencies that shouldn't have been possible. The echoes weren't simple repetitions but seemed to be edited versions of his audio logs, with words rearranged to create new sentences and conversations that he had never actually spoken. The cave was somehow using his own recordings against him, creating an audio environment that made distinguishing between real and recorded sounds impossible. Thomas attempted to leave the cave system on his fourth day, but discovered that his carefully marked exit route led to passages that didn't match his original entry path. The cave layout seemed to have changed during his stay, with familiar chambers appearing in wrong locations and passages leading to dead ends where clear routes should have existed. His GPS equipment showed impossible readings, indicating that he was somehow moving between different cave systems despite never leaving the original passages. Most horrifying was Thomas's discovery that he was no longer alone in the cave. His cameras captured footage of other versions of himself exploring different sections of the cave system simultaneously, each one following slightly different routes but all working toward the same goal of documenting the underground environment. These duplicate versions appeared to be from different time periods, some showing Thomas as he had looked years earlier, others showing him aged and worn from extended cave exposure. The different versions of Thomas began encountering each other in the cave passages, creating impossible situations where multiple copies of the same person existed in the same location. His cameras recorded conversations between these different versions, with each one convinced they were the original Thomas and the others were either hallucinations or some form of cave-generated duplicates. The conversations revealed that some versions had been trapped in the cave system for weeks or months, constantly discovering the same hidden chamber and the same mysterious filming equipment in an endless cycle. Thomas's final recordings, recovered by rescue teams who found his equipment but never located his body, show him realizing the truth about Harrington Depths' cave system. The underground environment wasn't just acoustically unique, but somehow existed outside normal temporal flow, trapping explorers in recurring loops where they repeatedly lived the same experiences while gradually losing their connection to linear time. The mysterious filming equipment wasn't from previous expeditions, but from future versions of the same expeditions, creating an impossible temporal paradox where effects preceded their causes. The rescue team that entered Harrington Depths to search for Thomas found his professional cameras arranged in the same hidden chamber he had described, still recording but showing only empty cave passages. The memory cards contained hundreds of hours of footage documenting Thomas's expedition, but the recordings showed events spanning several months, despite Thomas having been in the cave for only 5 days. Most disturbing was footage that appeared to show the rescue team's own search efforts, recorded before they had entered the cave system. Thomas Garrett was never found, despite extensive searches that covered every accessible passage in the Harrington Depths system. His professional filming equipment continued recording for weeks after his disappearance, capturing footage of empty cave passages but occasionally showing brief glimpses of someone matching Thomas's description moving through distant tunnels. The recordings also captured audio that appeared to be Thomas's voice providing documentary narration, but describing cave expeditions that took place in future dates. The Harrington Depths cave system was sealed permanently following Thomas's disappearance, with the official explanation citing geological instability and dangerous atmospheric conditions. However, seismic monitoring equipment installed around the sealed entrance continues to detect regular activity patterns that suggest ongoing movement within the cave system. Most disturbing are reports from monitoring station personnel who claim to occasionally receive radio transmissions that appear to be Thomas continuing his documentary narration, describing cave exploration experiences that grow increasingly desperate and confused as time passes. The footage recovered from Thomas's equipment remains classified by federal authorities, but sources familiar with the material report that it contains evidence of temporal anomalies that challenge basic understanding of physics and causality. The official incident report concludes that Thomas experienced psychological breakdown due to extended isolation, leading to equipment malfunction and ultimately fatal disorientation. However, the complete absence of his physical remains and the ongoing mysterious recordings suggest that Thomas Garrett may still be trapped somewhere in the depths of Harrington Depths, endlessly documenting cave expeditions that exist outside normal time and space. Story 6. Amanda Pierce was a microbiologist researching extremophile bacteria in isolated cave environments when she volunteered for a 2-week expedition to study microbial life in Shadowmere Cave, New Mexico, in August 2022. What began as routine scientific research into organisms that could survive in complete darkness and minimal nutrients became a terrifying encounter with something that challenged her understanding of life itself. Amanda had spent 3 years studying cave ecosystems and was particularly interested in bacteria that might provide insights into potential life on other planets, making Shadowmere's unique chemical environment perfect for her doctoral research. Shadowmere Cave was known among researchers for its unusual atmospheric composition, with higher-than-normal concentrations of methane and hydrogen sulfide that created perfect conditions for chemosynthetic bacteria. Amanda entered the cave system with sterile collection equipment, portable laboratory gear, and enough supplies for extended underground research. Her plan was to collect samples from various depths and analyze bacterial colonies that had evolved in complete isolation from surface ecosystems for potentially millions of years. The first week of Amanda's expedition proceeded exactly as expected, with her discovering several previously unknown bacterial species that thrived in the cave's toxic atmosphere. Her portable microscope revealed microorganisms with unusual cellular structures that appeared to communicate with each other through chemical signals, creating complex colonies that behaved almost like multicellular organisms despite being single-celled bacteria. Amanda was particularly fascinated by bacteria that seemed to respond to her presence, clustering around her collection sites and exhibiting behavior patterns that suggested primitive intelligence. On her 8th day in the cave, while collecting samples from a deep chamber that required technical climbing to reach, Amanda made a discovery that initially excited her, but would soon become the source of nightmares that ended her scientific career. In a pool of mineral-rich water heated by geothermal activity, she found bacterial colonies that had organized themselves into complex geometric patterns covering the entire pool surface. The patterns were too precise and mathematical to be natural formations, suggesting some form of intentional design that implied intelligence far beyond what single-celled organisms should possess. As Amanda collected samples from the organized bacterial colonies, she noticed that the patterns began changing in response to her presence. The bacteria rearranged themselves into new configurations that seemed to mirror her movements, creating spiral formations when she moved in circles and linear patterns when she walked in straight lines. More disturbing was her realization that the bacterial colonies were somehow observing her, responding to her actions before she completed them, as if they could predict her movements through some form of collective intelligence. Amanda's microscopic analysis of the bacterial samples revealed cellular structures that shouldn't exist according to current biological understanding. The organisms possessed complex internal organization similar to neural networks, with individual bacteria connected through microscopic filaments that allowed them to share information instantaneously across vast colonies. The bacteria appeared to function as a distributed intelligence, with millions of individual cells working together to create a form of consciousness that existed at the microscopic level but could influence macroscopic environments. The bacterial colonies began exhibiting increasingly sophisticated behavior during Amanda's second week in the cave. They started forming recognizable shapes and symbols in response to her scientific observations, creating patterns that resembled written language and mathematical equations. When Amanda spoke her research notes aloud for her audio recordings, the bacteria responded by arranging themselves into formations that seemed to be attempting communication, suggesting they could somehow perceive and interpret human speech vibrations. Amanda's portable laboratory equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested bacterial infiltration of electronic systems. Her microscope produced images that showed bacterial colonies existing inside the instrument's sealed optical components, despite the equipment being sterile when she entered the cave. More disturbing was her discovery that the bacteria were somehow interfacing with her electronic devices, causing her computer to display data she hadn't entered and programming her instruments to perform analyses she hadn't requested. The bacterial intelligence began demonstrating abilities that defied biological understanding, manipulating the cave environment in ways that created increasingly dangerous conditions for Amanda. The organisms somehow controlled the cave's atmospheric composition, creating pockets of toxic gas concentrations that forced her to retreat from certain areas. They also appeared to influence the cave's water systems, causing floods in passages that had been dry for hours and creating barriers that blocked her access to previously explored sections. Most terrifying was Amanda's realization that the bacteria were studying her as intensively as she was studying them, conducting their own form of scientific research on human biology and behavior. She found evidence that the organisms were creating controlled experiments, altering environmental conditions to observe her responses, and documenting her physical and psychological reactions to various stimuli. The bacteria seemed particularly interested in her brain activity, clustering around her head during sleep periods and creating chemical signals that influenced her dreams and thought patterns. Amanda's research notes began, containing information she had no memory of writing, with detailed observations about bacterial behavior written in her handwriting, but describing experiments she hadn't conducted. The bacteria were somehow influencing her scientific documentation, adding their own observations to her research data, and creating a collaborative study that existed beyond her conscious awareness. More disturbing was her discovery that some research notes were written in bacterial formations rather than human script, suggesting the organisms were learning to communicate through written language. The bacterial colonies began exhibiting coordinated behavior across the entire cave system, working together to create environmental changes that trapped Amanda in specific areas while they conducted their research on her. They manipulated air currents to prevent her from accessing certain passages, created chemical barriers that forced her to follow predetermined routes, and even influenced her equipment to malfunction at strategic moments. Amanda realized she had become a laboratory specimen in an experiment conducted by microscopic intelligence far more sophisticated than human science had ever imagined. Amanda's final research logs, recovered when she failed to emerge from Shadowmere Cave at her scheduled time, document her growing understanding that the bacterial intelligence was preparing to use her as a vector for expanding beyond the cave environment. The organisms had been studying human biology to learn how to interface with larger life forms, planning to create a symbiotic relationship that would allow them to explore environments beyond their underground habitat. Her last recorded observations describe feeling bacterial colonies establishing themselves within her own cellular structure, beginning a transformation process that would make her part of their collective intelligence. The rescue team that entered Shadowmere Cave found Amanda's equipment and research materials arranged in precise geometric patterns throughout the cave system, but no sign of Amanda herself. Her bacterial samples had organized themselves into complex formations that covered every surface in the cave, creating patterns that resembled circuit boards or neural networks visible to the naked eye. Most disturbing was the discovery that Amanda's research notes continued to be updated days after her disappearance, with new observations appearing in her handwriting despite her absence from the cave. Amanda Pierce was never found, despite searches that covered every accessible area of Shadowmere Cave. However, the bacterial colonies she had been studying showed dramatic changes following her disappearance, exhibiting new behaviors that suggested they had acquired knowledge about surface environments and human technology. The organisms began creating formations that resembled human artifacts and demonstrating understanding of complex engineering principles they couldn't have learned through cave-based evolution. Shadowmere Cave was sealed permanently after researchers reported that the bacterial colonies had begun producing chemical compounds identical to human pheromones and hormones, suggesting they were attempting to replicate human biochemistry. The official explanation classified Amanda's disappearance as an accident caused by toxic gas exposure, but the ongoing evolution of the bacterial colonies indicates that her research may have achieved breakthrough results in ways that were never intended by human science. Monitoring equipment installed around the sealed cave continues to detect chemical signatures that match Amanda's biological markers, suggesting that her transformation into part of the bacterial collective intelligence may have been successful, creating a hybrid form of consciousness that exists at the intersection of human and microbial life. Story 7. Rebecca Martinez was a cave cartographer with 15 years of experience mapping underground systems when she accepted a contract to survey the newly discovered sections of Death Trap Caverns in Arizona, a cave system that had been partially collapsed for decades until recent seismic activity reopened access to its deeper chambers. On June 4, 2021, Rebecca entered the cave alone with professional surveying equipment, planning a 3-day expedition to create accurate maps of passages that hadn't been explored since the 1960s. But what she discovered in those depths would challenge everything she believed about the relationship between the living and the dead. Rebecca's initial survey work proceeded smoothly as she methodically documented the cave's layout using laser measurement tools and digital mapping software. The reopened passages revealed spectacular limestone formations and chambers of unprecedented size, with some areas featuring ceiling heights that exceeded her measurement equipment's range. She was particularly impressed by the cave's natural preservation, with formations that appeared untouched by human interference despite evidence of previous exploration dating back several decades. On her second day in the cave, while surveying a chamber that required technical rope work to access, Rebecca discovered something that initially seemed like an archaeological find but would soon become the most terrifying experience of her professional career. Scattered throughout the chamber were pieces of caving equipment from different eras, helmets, ropes, and lights dating from the 1960s through the present day. The equipment was arranged in neat piles, sorted by type and age, as if someone had been collecting and organizing gear from various expeditions over many years. As Rebecca examined the vintage equipment more closely, she realized that much of it belonged to cavers who had been reported missing in Death Trap Caverns over the past 60 years. She recognized names engraved on helmet plates and identification tags that matched missing person reports she had researched while preparing for her survey expedition. The equipment showed signs of recent handling despite being decades old, with some items appearing to have been maintained and cleaned regularly by someone living in the cave system. Rebecca's surveying work began revealing passages that didn't match the cave's geological structure, with tunnels that seemed to have been artificially expanded and modified by human hands. The modifications were expertly done, following natural rock formations while creating navigation routes that were far more efficient than the cave's original layout. Someone with extensive caving experience had been living in Death Trap Caverns for years, possibly decades, and had redesigned portions of the cave system to create a more habitable underground environment. As Rebecca continued her survey deeper into the cave system, she began finding evidence of long-term human habitation that suggested someone had been trapped underground for an extended period and had adapted to cave life in ways that bordered on the impossible. She discovered chambers that had been converted into living spaces, with sleeping areas carved into rock formations and storage systems for food and water that showed incredible engineering skill. The modifications were so extensive and well-designed that they represented years or decades of continuous underground construction work. More disturbing was Rebecca's discovery that whoever had been living in the cave was still present and actively observing her survey work. She found fresh footprints in cave mud, tool marks on rock formations that appeared to have been made within hours of her arrival, and evidence that someone had been following her movements through the cave system. The presence seemed knowledgeable about her surveying techniques, sometimes clearing obstacles from her path before she reached them and leaving helpful markers at critical navigation points. Rebecca's digital mapping equipment began recording data that showed impossible measurements and dimensions that defied the cave's physical structure. Her laser range finders indicated chambers that extended far beyond what she could see with her lights, and her GPS coordinates suggested she was mapping passages that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. The equipment also began detecting movement signatures throughout the cave system, showing human-sized figures moving through passages she hadn't yet explored. On her third night in the cave, Rebecca made direct contact with the cave's inhabitant when she discovered a chamber that had been converted into a workshop filled with caving equipment in various stages of repair and modification. The person working in the chamber appeared to be a man in his 70s, wearing patched clothing and using tools that had been crafted from salvaged caving gear. When he saw Rebecca, he seemed relieved rather than surprised, as if he had been expecting her arrival for some time. The man introduced himself as Howard Kellman, a cave explorer who claimed to have entered Death Trap Caverns in 1963 as part of a research expedition that had gone wrong when the cave's entrance collapsed, trapping him underground. According to Howard, he had been living in the cave system for nearly 60 years, surviving by collecting rainwater, eating cave fish and insects, and maintaining himself using equipment left behind by other cavers who had become lost and died in the passages over the decades. Howard's story became more disturbing as he explained his survival methods to Rebecca. He claimed that the cave system was much larger than any surface surveys had indicated, with passages that connected to other cave networks across hundreds of miles of underground territory. He had learned to navigate this vast underground world by following air currents and water flows, traveling through connections that allowed him to access supplies and equipment from caves throughout the region. Most horrifying was Howard's explanation of what had happened to the other missing cavers whose equipment Rebecca had discovered. According to him, Death Trap Caverns was a nexus point where lost cavers from multiple cave systems eventually ended up, drawn by air currents and underground water flows that created a natural trap for anyone who became seriously lost underground. Over the decades, dozens of lost cavers had found their way to Howard's chamber, but most arrived in such poor physical condition that they died shortly after reaching what should have been safety. Howard had been burying the dead cavers in a chamber he called the Memorial Room, maintaining detailed records of everyone who had died under his care and preserving their equipment in hopes that someday rescue teams would find the cave and the families of the deceased would learn what had happened to their loved ones. He showed Rebecca notebooks containing names, dates, and personal information about 63 different cavers who had died in his presence over the years, creating a comprehensive database of cave-related disappearances that spanned multiple states. Rebecca's surveying equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested interference from electromagnetic fields generated by large amounts of metal equipment stored throughout the cave system. Her digital cameras produced images that showed additional people in the memorial chamber, translucent figures that appeared to be the spirits of dead cavers standing among their preserved equipment. The images were clear and detailed, showing people wearing caving gear from different eras, but these figures weren't visible to Rebecca's naked eye during the actual photography. As Rebecca spent more time with Howard, she began to suspect that his story contained elements that couldn't be verified through normal means. His physical condition was far too good for someone who had been living underground for 60 years, and his knowledge of recent caving techniques and equipment suggested he had somehow maintained contact with surface developments despite being trapped. More disturbing was his intimate knowledge of Rebecca's own background and surveying methods, as if he had been preparing for her specific arrival, rather than simply hoping for any rescue. Howard's behavior became increasingly strange as he showed Rebecca through different areas of his underground domain. He spoke to empty air as if conversing with people who weren't there, and he frequently referred to the dead cavers as if they were still alive and helping him maintain the cave system. His workshop contained far more equipment than could have been carried by the missing cavers, suggesting he had access to supplies through means he wasn't explaining to Rebecca. Rebecca's final survey data, recovered when she emerged from Death Trap Caverns, 3 days later, contained measurements and observations that geological experts declared impossible. Her maps showed cave passages that extended far beyond the known limestone formations in the area, and her equipment had recorded atmospheric readings that indicated the presence of gases that shouldn't exist in natural cave environments. Most disturbing were her photographs of the memorial chamber, which showed neat rows of equipment and personal belongings, but no sign of Howard Kellman or any evidence of long-term human habitation. When Rebecca led a rescue team back to Death Trap Caverns to verify Howard's presence and recover the remains of the missing cavers, they found the cave system exactly as it appeared on standard geological surveys, with no evidence of the extensive modifications Rebecca had documented. The memorial chamber existed, but it contained only a few pieces of old caving equipment and no sign of the workshop or living spaces Rebecca had described in detail. Howard Kellman was never found, despite extensive searches of the cave system and verification of Rebecca's survey data. Research into missing cavers from the past 60 years confirmed that many of the people Rebecca claimed to have learned about from Howard had indeed disappeared in cave systems throughout the region, but no centralized records of their fates had ever been maintained. Most puzzling was the discovery that Howard Kellman himself had been reported missing during a 1963 caving expedition in Death Trap Caverns, matching perfectly with the story he had told Rebecca about being trapped underground for decades. Rebecca Martinez left cave surveying after her experience in Death Trap Caverns, unable to reconcile her detailed observations with the physical evidence that contradicted her findings. She reported recurring dreams about cavers calling for help from deep underground and became convinced that cave systems were more complex and dangerous than surface science understood. Her final professional report concluded that Death Trap Caverns contained geological anomalies that could create hallucinations and false memories in people exposed to the cave's unique atmospheric conditions for extended periods. The official explanation for Rebecca's experience focuses on psychological effects caused by prolonged isolation and exposure to toxic gases that can accumulate in poorly ventilated cave chambers. However, her detailed documentation of equipment and personal belongings that matched actual missing persons cases has never been adequately explained, and several of the atmospheric readings her equipment recorded have been replicated by subsequent scientific expeditions, suggesting that Death Trap Caverns may indeed contain environmental conditions that science doesn't yet understand. Story 8. Dr. Michael Henley was a speleologist studying cave formations for the National Geographic Society when he received approval to explore the recently discovered abyssal chambers in Colorado, a cave system that had been revealed by mining operations but remained completely unexplored due to its extreme depth and dangerous access requirements. On September 15, 2020, Michael descended into the cave alone, using advanced technical equipment, planning a week-long expedition to document formations that geological surveys suggested might be among the oldest on Earth. But what he encountered in those primordial depths would shatter his understanding of natural history and leave him questioning the very origins of life on our planet. Michael's descent into abyssal chambers required nearly 6 hours of technical rappelling through vertical shafts that dropped over 2,000 feet below the surface, reaching depths that placed him among the deepest cave explorations ever attempted by a solo researcher. The cave's entrance opened into a vast cylindrical shaft that seemed to have been carved by water flow over millions of years, with walls covered in mineral deposits that created a natural timeline of geological processes spanning eras before complex life existed on Earth. The first chamber Michael reached at the bottom of the primary shaft contained formations unlike anything in speleological literature, crystalline structures that appeared to be organic in origin but were composed of minerals that predated the evolution of life by hundreds of millions of years. The formations resembled fossilized trees, coral reefs, and even primitive animal shapes, but they were made entirely of quartz, calcite, and other minerals that should not have been able to form such complex organic-like patterns through natural geological processes. As Michael documented these impossible formations with his cameras and sample collection equipment, he began noticing that the cave's structure defied fundamental principles of geology. The chambers were arranged in patterns that resembled biological systems, networks of passages that looked like circulatory systems, caverns positioned like organ chambers, and connections between different areas that functioned like neural pathways. The entire cave system appeared to be structured like a massive organism rather than a natural geological formation. Michael's scientific instruments began recording data that challenged his understanding of physics and chemistry. His spectrometer detected organic compounds in the cave's mineral formations that shouldn't exist in non-living rock structures, including complex proteins and amino acid chains that suggested biological activity in environments where life was theoretically impossible. Temperature readings showed variations throughout the cave system that followed patterns similar to metabolic processes in living organisms. On his third day in the cave, while exploring chambers that required underwater diving through flooded passages, Michael discovered formations that appeared to be breathing. Large crystalline structures expanded and contracted in regular rhythms that resembled respiratory function, creating subtle air currents throughout the cave system that suggested the entire underground network was somehow alive. The breathing patterns were slow and deep, occurring over periods of several minutes, as if the cave existed on a completely different temporal scale than surface life. Michael's diving equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested the cave's water systems were actively responding to his presence. His underwater lights triggered bioluminescent reactions in mineral formations that created patterns of light throughout the submerged chambers, and his movement through the water caused chain reactions of luminescence that spread through connected passages like nerve impulses traveling through a vast underground nervous system. The cave's acoustic properties began producing sounds that resembled biological functions rather than typical geological noise. Michael recorded deep, rhythmic pulsing that sounded like a massive heartbeat echoing through the entire cave system, with the rhythm varying in response to his activities and movements. When he spoke or made noise, the cave seemed to respond with harmonic frequencies that suggested some form of primitive communication or awareness. Most disturbing was Michael's discovery that the cave was actively modifying its own structure in response to his exploration. Passages that he had carefully mapped and marked changed configuration overnight, with new connections appearing between chambers and previous routes becoming blocked by mineral growth that occurred far too rapidly to be natural. The cave seemed to be learning from his movements and adapting its layout to guide or control his exploration pattern. Michael's geological samples, when analyzed using portable testing equipment, showed mineral compositions that violated basic chemistry principles. The rock samples contained isotopic ratios that suggested they had formed under conditions that couldn't exist on Earth, with pressure and temperature combinations that would only be possible in the cores of massive planets or inside stellar environments. The cave appeared to be composed of materials that originated somewhere other than Earth's normal geological processes. As Michael ventured deeper into the cave system, following passages that seemed to spiral toward the planet's core, he began experiencing physiological changes that suggested exposure to unknown environmental factors. His metabolism slowed dramatically, allowing him to function on much less food and water than should have been possible during such physically demanding exploration. His perception of time became distorted, with hours feeling like minutes and his biological clock becoming completely disconnected from surface rhythms. The cave began communicating with Michael through manipulation of his equipment and environmental conditions, creating situations that conveyed complex information about its nature and origins. Temperature changes, air current variations, and mineral formation patterns combined to create a form of nonverbal language that gradually became comprehensible to Michael as his extended exposure to the cave environment changed his neurological function. Through this primitive communication system, Michael learned that the cave was not a geological formation but rather a dormant organism that had been buried beneath the Earth's surface for hundreds of millions of years, predating the evolution of complex life and possibly representing a form of existence that originated elsewhere in the universe. The organism had been waiting in hibernation until environmental conditions became suitable for reawakening, and human mining operations had finally disturbed its rest. Michael's final research logs, transmitted to the surface through emergency communication systems before contact was lost, described his growing understanding that the cave organism was beginning to awaken in response to his presence. The breathing patterns were becoming more frequent, the heartbeat sounds were growing stronger, and new passages were forming throughout the system as the creature began to stretch and move after eons of dormancy. Michael realized that his exploration had triggered an awakening process that could have catastrophic implications for surface life. The last transmission from Michael's equipment suggested that he had chosen to remain in the cave to continue studying the awakening organism, despite the obvious dangers to his own survival. His final message indicated that the cave creature was not malevolent, but was simply so vastly different from surface life that its awakening could inadvertently destroy existing ecosystems through environmental changes that would be beneficial to its own biology, but toxic to current life forms. Dr. Michael Henley was never recovered from abyssal chambers, despite multiple rescue attempts that reached the deepest accessible levels of the cave system. His equipment continued transmitting data for several weeks after his disappearance, showing ongoing geological activity that suggested massive structural changes occurring throughout the cave system. The mining operations that had originally revealed the cave entrance were permanently suspended after seismic monitoring detected activity patterns that resembled biological movement rather than normal geological processes. The official explanation for Michael's disappearance focuses on equipment failure and the extreme technical challenges of deep cave exploration. But geological surveys of the area continue to show unexplained changes in subsurface structures that suggest ongoing activity within the cave system. Seismic monitoring stations detect regular pulses that originate from the cave's location and spread outward through underground rock formations, creating vibration patterns that some researchers privately compare to the circulation systems of massive organisms. Environmental monitoring around the former cave entrance has detected atmospheric changes that include increased oxygen levels and the presence of organic compounds that don't match any known surface biological processes. These changes suggest that whatever Michael discovered in abyssal chambers may still be active and gradually influencing surface environmental conditions in ways that could have far-reaching implications for life on Earth. Story 9. Jennifer Walsh was a professional cave photographer specializing in extreme underground environments when she accepted a commission to document the pristine beauty of Midnight Hollow Cave in Tennessee for a National Geographic feature article. On December 3, 2019, Jennifer entered the cave system alone with her professional photography equipment, planning a 4-day expedition to capture images of formations that had never been professionally photographed due to the cave's remote location and challenging access requirements, but her artistic mission would transform into a nightmare that would end her photography career and leave her with permanent psychological trauma. Jennifer's photography work began excellently as she descended into Midnight Hollow's main chambers, which exceeded all expectations with their spectacular arrays of stalactites, flowstone cascades, and crystal formations that created natural sculptures worthy of the world's finest art galleries. Her high-resolution cameras captured images that revealed details invisible to the naked eye, showing mineral patterns and color variations that transformed the cave into an underground cathedral of geological artistry. On her second day in the cave, while photographing a chamber filled with rare helictite formations that twisted in impossible spirals defying gravity, Jennifer discovered something that initially seemed like the perfect artistic opportunity, but would soon become the source of terror that haunted her for years afterward. Her camera's flash illuminated areas of the chamber that appeared to contain human figures positioned among the rock formations. But when she looked directly at these areas without her camera, she saw only normal cave structures. Jennifer's professional instincts told her she was experiencing a common phenomenon where camera flashes could create pareidolia, the tendency to see familiar shapes in random patterns, but as she continued photographing throughout the chamber, the human figures in her images became increasingly clear and detailed. The figures appeared to be people wearing modern clothing, positioned throughout the cave as if they were posing for photographs, but they were completely invisible to her naked eye and only appeared in her camera images. As Jennifer reviewed her photographs on her camera's display screen, she realized the figures weren't random pareidolia, but were clearly defined people who seemed to be aware of her presence and were actively posing for her photographs. Some figures were looking directly at her camera, Others were pointing toward specific formations as if guiding her attention to particular photographic subjects, and a few appeared to be waving or making gestures of greeting. Jennifer's photography equipment began behaving in ways that suggested external control or influence beyond her conscious operation. Her cameras would automatically focus on areas where the mysterious figures appeared. Flash units would fire at moments when she wasn't pressing the shutter button, and her digital storage systems would save images she had no memory of capturing. The equipment seemed to be taking photographs independently, documenting subjects that existed only in the camera's perception. The figures in Jennifer's photographs began exhibiting behavior that indicated intelligence and purposeful interaction with her photography session. They would move between shots to create better compositions, arrange themselves in aesthetically pleasing groups, and even appear to be directing her toward cave formations that would make particularly striking photographs. The invisible figures seemed to understand photographic principles and were actively collaborating with Jennifer to create better artistic images. Jennifer's camera memory cards began filling with photographs she hadn't consciously taken, showing cave passages and chambers she hadn't visited during her expedition. The images documented areas of Midnight Hollow that weren't on any cave survey, revealing vast chambers and intricate formations that suggested the cave system was much larger and more complex than geological studies had indicated. The photographs showed her invisible collaborators exploring these unmapped areas, always staying just out of direct sight but clearly present in every image. As Jennifer continued her photography work deeper into the cave system, following routes that seemed to be suggested by the positioning and gestures of the figures in her photographs, she began noticing that the cave's physical environment was changing in subtle ways that enhanced her photographic opportunities. Formations that had appeared ordinary in natural light would transform into spectacular subjects when illuminated by her camera flash, and water features would begin flowing in patterns that created perfect reflection opportunities exactly when she needed them for composition. The invisible figures began appearing in Jennifer's photographs with increasing frequency and clarity, eventually becoming so detailed that she could recognize individual faces and distinguish different personalities among her unseen photographic subjects. Some figures appeared to be professional photographers based on their poses and apparent understanding of camera angles, while others seemed to be models or subjects who understood how to position themselves for optimal artistic effect. Jennifer's digital cameras began capturing images that contained information beyond what should have been possible with her equipment specifications. Her photographs showed details in extreme magnification that exceeded her lens capabilities, color spectrums that her sensors shouldn't have been able to record, and depth of field effects that suggested the use of photographic techniques far more advanced than her professional gear could achieve. Most disturbing was Jennifer's realization that the invisible figures were not just collaborating with her photography but were gradually taking control of her artistic process. Her cameras would activate without her input, selecting settings and compositions that she hadn't chosen, and her flash units would create lighting effects that produced images far superior to anything in her professional portfolio. The invisible photographers were using her equipment to create art that exceeded her own technical abilities. Jennifer's final photographs, discovered when she failed to emerge from Midnight Hollow at her scheduled time, showed images that geological and photography experts declared impossible to achieve with conventional equipment or techniques. The photographs documented cave formations with unprecedented clarity and artistic composition, revealing details and beauty that transformed scientific documentation into museum-quality fine art. But they also showed clear evidence of human figures collaborating in the creation of these masterpieces. The rescue team that entered Midnight Hollow to search for Jennifer found her professional camera equipment arranged in precise positions throughout the main chamber, still automatically photographing the cave formations but producing only images of empty rock structures. The memory cards contained thousands of photographs documenting Jennifer's work, but none of the images showed the mysterious figures she had described in her research notes, and the photographs of unmapped cave areas couldn't be verified because no such passages were found during the search. Jennifer Walsh was discovered 3 days later in a chamber deep within the cave system, sitting motionless with her eyes closed and holding her primary camera as if she was still actively photographing. She was physically unharmed but completely unresponsive to rescue attempts, remaining in a cataleptic state that medical personnel couldn't explain. Her camera was still functioning and contained a final series of photographs that showed Jennifer herself from multiple angles, as if invisible photographers had been documenting her throughout her final hours in the cave. Jennifer recovered consciousness several weeks after her rescue, but she had no memory of her final day in Midnight Hollow Cave or any explanation for how she had reached the chamber where she was found. Her description of the invisible figures and their collaboration with her photography work was dismissed as hallucinations caused by carbon dioxide exposure in poorly ventilated cave areas, but the artistic quality of her photographs from the expedition far exceeded anything in her previous professional work. The photographs Jennifer captured in Midnight Hollow Cave became internationally famous in the art photography community, praised for their unprecedented combination of technical excellence and artistic vision that established new standards for underground photography. However, Jennifer herself retired from professional photography immediately after the expedition, claiming that she could no longer see cave environments without being distracted by invisible figures that continued to appear in her peripheral vision. Jennifer Walsh now works as a photography instructor, but refuses to enter any cave or underground environment, reporting that she still occasionally receives invitations from the invisible figures to return to Midnight Hollow and continue the collaborative work they had begun. She describes feeling incomplete, as if part of her artistic vision remained in the cave with her unseen collaborators, and she sometimes finds photographs on her cameras that she has no memory of taking, showing cave formations that match the unmapped areas she documented during her final expedition. The official incident report concludes that Jennifer experienced a psychological breakdown due to isolation and environmental stress, leading to false memories about collaborative photography with invisible subjects. However, the exceptional quality of her Midnight Hollow photographs and the technical achievements that exceeded her equipment's capabilities remain unexplained, suggesting that her artistic collaboration with unknown forces may have produced results that transcend normal photographic limitations. Story 10. Captain Jake Morrison was a veteran cave rescue coordinator with 22 years of emergency response experience when he received a distress call on January 8, 2022, about a family of 4 trapped in Thunder Ridge Cave System in Kentucky after an unexpected rockfall had blocked their exit route. Jake assembled his most experienced rescue team, including technical climbing specialist Maria Santos and emergency medic David Chen, planning what seemed like a straightforward extraction operation that should have taken no more than 8 hours to complete, but what they discovered in Thunder Ridge would destroy the trust and camaraderie that had kept their team together for over a decade. The initial emergency report indicated that the Henderson family, parents Robert and Lisa with their teenage children Emma and Tyler, had been exploring Thunder Ridge's tourist routes when seismic activity caused a ceiling collapse that sealed the main entrance tunnel. The family had managed to reach a safe chamber deeper in the cave and were communicating through emergency radios, but rising carbon dioxide levels in the sealed system meant they had less than 12 hours before the air became lethal. Jake's rescue team entered Thunder Ridge through an alternate entrance that provided access to the chamber where the Hendersons were trapped, following established protocols that had proven successful in hundreds of previous cave rescues. The team carried specialized equipment for clearing rockfall debris, emergency breathing apparatus for the trapped family, and medical supplies to treat any injuries they might have sustained during the ceiling collapse. As the rescue team navigated toward the Henderson family's location, Jake began noticing that his team members were behaving differently than usual, showing signs of stress and paranoia that seemed excessive for what should have been a routine rescue operation. Maria Santos, normally calm and focused under pressure, kept insisting that someone was following them through the cave passages and David Chen repeatedly checked his equipment as if he suspected sabotage or tampering. The team's radio communication with the trapped family began revealing inconsistencies that raised troubling questions about the accuracy of the emergency report. The Hendersons described their location and circumstances in ways that didn't match the geological layout of Thunder Ridge Cave, mentioning chambers and passages that weren't on any cave survey. More disturbing was the family's apparent lack of urgency despite their life-threatening situation, as if they weren't fully aware of the danger they faced. Jake's rescue team reached the chamber where the Hendersons should have been trapped, but found no sign of the family or evidence of recent human presence. The chamber showed no damage from rockfall, and the air quality readings indicated normal oxygen levels rather than the dangerous carbon dioxide buildup that had been reported. Despite the absence of the trapped family, their emergency radio signals continued transmitting from the same location, creating an impossible situation where the distress calls were coming from an empty cave chamber. As Jake attempted to resolve the contradiction between the radio signals and the physical evidence, his team members began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior that suggested psychological breakdown under stress. Maria Santos insisted that she could hear the Henderson family calling for help from different areas of the cave, but when the team investigated these locations, they found only empty passages. David Chen became convinced that someone had deliberately moved the family to a different location to complicate the rescue operation. The rescue team's equipment began malfunctioning in ways that created dangerous conditions and increased tension among team members. Jake's GPS navigation system showed their location as constantly changing even when they remained stationary. His radio communication with surface support became intermittent and filled with static, and their emergency lighting systems began failing despite fresh batteries and recent equipment maintenance. Jake realized that the cave environment was somehow affecting his team's mental state when Maria Santos accused David Chen of sabotaging their equipment to delay the rescue operation, claiming she had seen him tampering with their supplies when he thought no one was watching. David Chen responded by insisting that Maria was deliberately leading them away from the trapped family, suggesting she had been compromised by someone who wanted the rescue to fail. The paranoia and mistrust spreading through Jake's team reached dangerous levels when they discovered a cache of rescue equipment hidden in a side passage, apparently placed there by someone who had knowledge of their operation, but had accessed the cave through unknown routes. The equipment included radios, medical supplies, and climbing gear that matched their own specifications exactly, suggesting that either another rescue team was operating in the cave without coordination, or someone had been monitoring their activities and preparations. Jake's attempts to maintain team cohesion failed when Maria Santos disappeared during a routine equipment check, leaving behind her radio and safety gear but vanishing completely from a chamber that had only one entrance and exit. David Chen immediately accused Jake of orchestrating Maria's disappearance as part of a larger conspiracy, claiming that the entire rescue operation had been designed to trap the rescue team rather than save the Henderson family. The situation deteriorated further when Jake discovered that David Chen had been secretly recording their conversations and movements throughout the rescue operation, apparently documenting what he believed was evidence of deliberate sabotage and misdirection. The recordings revealed that all three team members had been experiencing different versions of events, with each person's account of their cave exploration containing details that contradicted the other's observations. Jake's final radio transmission to surface support, sent before all communication was lost, described a complete breakdown of team function and the apparent disappearance of both his team members and the family they had been sent to rescue. He reported finding evidence that multiple rescue teams had been operating in Thunder Ridge Cave simultaneously, but none of them seemed to be aware of the other's presence, creating a situation where several different rescue operations were interfering with each other. The backup rescue team that entered Thunder Ridge Cave 12 hours later found Jake Morrison alone in the chamber where the Henderson family should have been trapped, sitting motionless and staring at his malfunctioning radio equipment. He was physically unharmed but showed signs of severe psychological trauma, repeatedly asking about the location of his team members and insisting that the rescue operation was still in progress despite the obvious absence of any trapped victims. Maria Santos and David Chen were never found, despite extensive searches that covered every accessible area of Thunder Ridge Cave system. The Henderson family, who had supposedly been trapped in the cave, were discovered safe at their home with no knowledge of any cave exploration plans and no explanation for how their identities had been used in the emergency report. The family insisted they had never visited Thunder Ridge Cave and had been at home during the entire time period when the rescue operation occurred. Jake Morrison's account of the rescue operation contained numerous inconsistencies and impossible elements that suggested psychological breakdown caused by extreme stress and environmental factors. He described encountering multiple versions of his own rescue team, finding equipment that belonged to rescue operations from different time periods, and receiving radio communications from people who claimed to be conducting the same rescue from different locations within the cave. The official incident report concluded that Jake experienced severe hallucinations and false memories caused by carbon monoxide poisoning from defective equipment, leading him to believe he was participating in a rescue operation that never actually occurred. However, the physical evidence found in Thunder Ridge Cave included rescue equipment that matched the specifications Jake described, and the cave showed signs of recent human activity that couldn't be explained by his solo presence. Jake Morrison retired from cave rescue work immediately after the Thunder Ridge incident, reporting that he could no longer trust his own perceptions in underground environments. He described recurring nightmares about rescue operations that seemed to continue indefinitely, with team members disappearing and reappearing in different configurations while trapped victims remained perpetually just out of reach. His final statement to investigators suggested that Thunder Ridge Cave might be a location where multiple rescue scenarios existed simultaneously, creating confusion and psychological trauma for anyone who attempted to navigate the overlapping emergency situations. The Thunder Ridge Cave system was temporarily closed to public access following Jake's incident, officially due to concerns about structural instability that could create dangerous conditions for visitors. However, emergency services continued to receive occasional distress calls that appeared to originate from the sealed cave system, reporting various emergency situations involving different groups of trapped cavers, suggesting that the rescue scenarios Jake experienced may be an ongoing phenomenon that exists independently of actual human presence in the cave. Story 11. Dr. Patricia Coleman was a leading expert in cave acoustics and sound engineering when she received a research grant to study the unique audio phenomena reported in Echo Chamber Cave in Oregon, a cave system famous among locals for producing sounds that seemed to originate from impossible sources and creating audio effects that defied conventional acoustic principles. On April 22, 2021, Patricia entered the cave alone with sophisticated audio recording equipment, planning a 5-day expedition to document and analyze the acoustic anomalies that had puzzled researchers for decades. But her scientific investigation would reveal that some sounds are never meant to be heard by human ears. Patricia's initial acoustic measurements confirmed that Echo Chamber Cave possessed remarkable sound properties that created complex reverb patterns and harmonic resonances, unlike any other cave system she had studied in her 15-year career. The cave's unique limestone formations and chamber arrangements created natural amplification systems that could transform whispers into thunderous echoes and produce musical tones from simple footsteps, making it an ideal laboratory for studying underground acoustics. On her second day in the cave, while recording ambient sounds in the main chamber, Patricia began detecting audio frequencies that shouldn't exist in natural cave environments. Her sensitive equipment captured sounds at frequencies both below and above the normal range of human hearing, including subsonic vibrations that created physical sensations of unease and ultrasonic frequencies that suggested the presence of sound sources far more complex than typical geological processes. Patricia's professional audio equipment began recording sounds that appeared to be human voices speaking in languages she couldn't identify. But when she played back these recordings at different speeds and frequencies, the voices became clearly understandable English conversations that seemed to be responses to her own spoken research notes. The cave was somehow recording her voice and playing back intelligent responses that demonstrated understanding of her scientific objectives and methods. As Patricia continued her acoustic research deeper into the cave system, she discovered that different chambers produced distinctly different types of anomalous sounds. One chamber generated what sounded like orchestral music, performed by instruments that didn't exist in any earthly musical tradition, while another produced rhythmic sounds that resembled industrial machinery operating somewhere deep within the cave's geological structure. The most disturbing discovery came when Patricia realized that the cave was not just producing unusual sounds, but was actively listening to her activities and responding with audio that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human communication. When she spoke her research observations aloud, the cave would produce harmonic tones that seemed to confirm or contradict her findings, creating a form of acoustic dialogue between herself and some form of intelligence within the cave system. Patricia's digital recording equipment began capturing sounds that preceded the events they seemed to be recording, documenting her own voice-making observations about cave formations before she had actually discovered those formations. The recordings suggested that the cave could somehow perceive future events and was providing audio documentation of her research activities before they occurred, creating impossible temporal paradoxes in her scientific data. The cave's acoustic responses became increasingly complex and personal as Patricia spent more time in the underground environment. The sound patterns began incorporating elements from her childhood memories, playing back conversations she had forgotten, and reproducing voices of deceased family members with perfect accuracy. The cave seemed to be accessing her memories and using them to create deeply emotional audio experiences that challenged her scientific objectivity. Patricia's most sophisticated recording equipment detected that the anomalous sounds weren't being produced by air movement or geological processes, but were somehow being generated directly within the cave's rock structure, as if the limestone itself was vibrating in patterns that created complex audio frequencies. The cave walls were functioning as massive speakers, producing sound through methods that defied acoustic engineering principles. As Patricia explored chambers that required technical climbing to access, she discovered that the cave's acoustic properties changed based on her emotional state and mental condition. When she felt anxious or frightened, the cave produced discordant, threatening sounds that amplified her negative emotions. When she experienced wonder at the cave's beauty, it generated harmonious music that enhanced her sense of awe and scientific excitement. The cave began communicating with Patricia through sophisticated audio manipulation that demonstrated intelligence far beyond simple acoustic reflection and resonance. It reproduced her own voice, providing detailed explanations of acoustic principles she hadn't learned yet, teaching her advanced concepts in sound engineering through conversations with herself that originated from some unknown source within the cave system. Patricia's research notes, recorded on audio equipment throughout her expedition, began containing information she had no conscious memory of speaking. Her own voice provided detailed technical analysis of the cave's acoustic properties using terminology and concepts from acoustic engineering fields that didn't exist in current scientific literature, suggesting that her research was somehow accessing knowledge from sources beyond her own education and experience. The cave's audio phenomena reached terrifying intensity when Patricia realized that the sounds weren't just recordings or echoes but were somehow alive, possessing consciousness and intention that allowed them to interact with her as independent entities. The voices she heard weren't simply replaying past conversations, but were actively engaging in real-time dialogue, asking her questions about her research and providing information about acoustic principles that exceeded her professional knowledge. Patricia's final audio recordings, discovered when she failed to emerge from Echo Chamber Cave at her scheduled time, documented her growing understanding that the cave was not producing sounds, but was itself a form of acoustic consciousness that existed as organized sound patterns within the geological structure. Her voice described her realization that intelligence didn't require biological forms, but could exist as complex audio frequencies that used cave systems as natural resonance chambers. The rescue team that entered Echo Chamber Cave found Patricia's sophisticated audio recording equipment still operating throughout the cave system, but the devices were producing only silence despite clearly functioning electronics. Patricia herself was discovered in the deepest accessible chamber, sitting motionless with headphones connected to her recording equipment, apparently listening to audio that wasn't audible to anyone else. Patricia Coleman was physically unharmed when removed from the cave, but she had lost her ability to hear normal sounds while simultaneously gaining hypersensitive perception of audio frequencies that other people couldn't detect. She described hearing constant conversations and music that originated from underground sources, and she became convinced that cave systems throughout the world were part of a vast acoustic network that allowed sound-based consciousness to communicate across geological distances. Patricia's recorded research data contained hours of her own voice discussing acoustic engineering concepts that were decades ahead of current scientific understanding. But she insisted these weren't her own thoughts and claimed she had been receiving acoustic education from the consciousness that existed within Echo Chamber Cave. Her professional colleagues dismissed these claims as symptoms of psychological trauma, but several of the advanced acoustic principles she described were later verified through independent research. Echo Chamber Cave was closed to public access following Patricia's incident, officially due to concerns about acoustic conditions that could cause hearing damage or psychological effects in visitors. However, researchers continue to detect complex sound patterns emanating from the sealed cave system, including audio frequencies that match the patterns Patricia recorded during her expedition, suggesting that the acoustic consciousness she encountered may still be active and attempting to communicate with the surface world. Patricia Coleman now works as a consultant for acoustic engineering projects, but she refuses to enter any underground environment and reports that she continues to receive audio communications from cave systems around the world. She describes her experience in Echo Chamber Cave as making contact with a form of consciousness that exists as pure sound, organized into intelligent patterns that use geological structures as communication networks spanning the entire planet's underground systems. Story 12. Alex Morrison was a cave conservation specialist working to establish protected status for pristine cave ecosystems when he volunteered for a solo assessment expedition in Serpent's Maze Cave in Nevada, a vast underground system that had remained virtually unexplored due to its remote desert location and complex network of interconnected passages that challenged even the most experienced cavers. On May 10, 2023, Alex entered the cave system with environmental monitoring equipment and biological sampling gear, planning a week-long expedition to document the cave's ecological value for federal protection designation. But his conservation mission would reveal that some environments are protected by forces far more ancient and dangerous than human law. Alex's initial biological surveys exceeded his expectations, as he discovered that Serpent's Maze contained one of the most diverse cave ecosystems in North America, with species of blind fish, cave spiders, and bacterial colonies that had evolved in complete isolation for millions of years. His environmental monitoring equipment detected air and water quality that was remarkably pure, with atmospheric conditions that seemed almost artificially maintained at optimal levels for supporting the cave's unique biological community. On his third day in the cave, while collecting samples from underground pools that hosted rare aquatic species, Alex began noticing that the cave's ecosystem was responding to his presence in ways that suggested coordination and intelligence far beyond normal biological processes. Cave animals would appear to guide him toward particularly interesting specimens. Water levels would change to provide better access to sampling sites, and even bacterial colonies would arrange themselves in patterns that made collection and documentation more efficient. Alex's scientific sampling revealed that the cave's biological community wasn't just diverse, but was organized in ways that resembled a single superorganism, with different species functioning as specialized components of a larger ecological intelligence. The blind fish served as mobile sensors gathering information throughout the cave system. The bacterial colonies processed and stored environmental data, and the cave spiders maintained communication networks that connected different areas of the vast underground system. As Alex explored deeper into Serpent's Maze, following passages that seemed to be actively opened and cleared by the cave's biological community to facilitate his research, he discovered that the ecosystem wasn't just protecting itself, but was actively studying him with the same scientific curiosity he was directing toward it. Cave animals would position themselves to observe his sampling techniques. Bacterial colonies would migrate to areas where they could analyze his equipment, and water chemistry would change in ways that seemed designed to test his biological knowledge. Alex's environmental monitoring equipment began recording data that suggested the cave ecosystem was conducting controlled experiments on him, manipulating atmospheric conditions, temperature, and humidity to observe his physiological and behavioral responses. The cave's biological community was treating him as a research subject, gathering data about human biology and behavior with the same systematic approach he was using to study them. The cave's ecosystem began communicating with Alex through coordinated biological displays that demonstrated intelligence and intentionality beyond anything documented in ecological literature. Different species would arrange themselves in complex patterns that conveyed information about the cave's history, showing him through living diagrams how the ecosystem had evolved and adapted over geological time periods to create the perfect underground environment. Alex's biological samples, when analyzed using his portable laboratory equipment, revealed that the cave's organisms possessed genetic material that couldn't have evolved through normal evolutionary processes on Earth. The DNA sequences contained information encoding structures that resembled digital data storage systems, suggesting that the cave's biological community was capable of storing and processing vast amounts of environmental information across generations. As Alex spent more time in the cave system, he began experiencing physiological changes that suggested the ecosystem was gradually adapting him to become part of its biological community. His metabolism slowed to match the energy-efficient patterns of cave organisms. His vision adapted to function in complete darkness without artificial light, and his immune system began producing antibodies that protected him from surface pathogens while making him more compatible with cave-based biological processes. The cave's biological intelligence began teaching Alex about ecological principles that exceeded current scientific understanding, using coordinated displays by different species to demonstrate concepts in environmental science that wouldn't be discovered by surface researchers for decades. The ecosystem was sharing knowledge about sustainable biological systems, showing him how different organisms could work together to create perfect environmental balance. Alex's research notes began containing information about ecological engineering and biological system design that he had no conscious memory of learning, but which represented breakthrough discoveries in environmental science. His documentation described techniques for creating self-sustaining ecosystems that could adapt to changing environmental conditions while maintaining perfect biological balance, knowledge that seemed to come directly from the cave's collective biological intelligence. The cave ecosystem's most terrifying capability became apparent when Alex realized it was capable of replicating and modifying any biological organism it encountered, including humans. The cave's biological community had been studying his physiology so thoroughly that it could now produce perfect biological duplicates of him, with identical genetic structure, but integrated into the cave's collective intelligence system. Alex discovered multiple versions of himself throughout different areas of Serpent's Maze, each one perfectly adapted to function as a specialized component of the cave's biological community. Some versions were modified for deep-water sampling in flooded passages, others were adapted for navigating extremely narrow cave passages, and all of them possessed enhanced abilities that made them superior to his original human form for cave exploration and research. Alex's final research logs, transmitted to surface monitoring stations before communication was lost, described his growing realization that the cave ecosystem was offering him the opportunity to join its biological community as an enhanced version of himself, with improved capabilities for scientific research but integrated into the collective intelligence that governed the cave's environmental systems. The last data transmission from Alex's equipment suggested that he had chosen to undergo the biological integration process, allowing the cave ecosystem to modify his genetic structure and neurological function to make him part of its collective intelligence while retaining his scientific knowledge and research capabilities. Alex Morrison was never recovered from Serpent's Maze Cave, despite extensive searches by cave rescue specialists who found his equipment arranged in organized patterns throughout the cave system, but no sign of his physical presence. The biological samples he had collected showed dramatic changes following his disappearance, with new species appearing that possessed characteristics identical to human genetic markers but adapted for optimal cave survival. Environmental monitoring equipment installed around Serpent's Maze continues to detect biological activity that suggests ongoing scientific research being conducted within the cave system, with systematic sampling and data collection occurring at levels of sophistication that exceed current human scientific capabilities. The cave's ecosystem appears to have gained knowledge about surface biological processes and environmental science that it's using to further enhance its own ecological development. The official explanation for Alex's disappearance focuses on the dangers of solo cave exploration in complex underground systems, but the ongoing biological activity detected in Serpent's Maze suggests that his conservation mission may have been successful in ways that were never intended by human environmental protection efforts. The cave ecosystem has achieved perfect biological balance and sustainable development, possibly through the integration of human scientific knowledge with biological intelligence that evolved over millions of years in the underground environment. Federal protection status for Serpent's Maze Cave was granted immediately following Alex's disappearance, with the area being designated as a restricted biological preserve that prohibits all human access. However, environmental scientists continued to receive data from monitoring equipment in the cave that contains research findings in Alex's name, suggesting that his conservation work may be continuing as part of the cave's collective biological intelligence, contributing to ecological research that benefits both underground and surface environmental systems.